I was diagnosed with REM sleep behavior disorder, but the way that I found out I had it was I jumped through a second story window of a La Quinta Inn in Walla Walla, Washington, which, by the way, I'm returning to in January.
That's the most depressing part of that story.
That I'm going back.
Yeah, no, that it's a La Quinta. Mike, where does this podcast find you?
in my Working It Out podcast studio in Brooklyn, New York, where I live.
Nice. So let's bust right into it. Your latest tour and is now a special on Netflix, The Old Man in the Pool, which Mike, I don't like culture, but I went and saw your show, and it was wonderful. I literally that statement, I laughed, I cried. It's actually true here. I took my 16-year-old son. We bonded over it. He was really into it. It's about getting older, mortality, and fatherhood. Can you walk us through kind of your creative process? How did this come together and manifest itself in a one-man show?
I started doing these solo shows that are like a hybrid of stand-up and theater. The first one was in 2008, and it was called Sleepwalk with Me. And it came out of I went to Georgetown and I studied dramatic writing, and then I was doing stand-up at the same time in Washington, D.C. when I was in college. And at a certain point, I thought, well, if I merge these two ideas, I think that that could make for something that's sort of interesting. So I did this first show called Sleepwalk with Me in 2008, and I did it off Broadway in New York, and Nathan Lane presented it, and it was a big inflection point in my life and career. And then I've ended up doing this is the fifth one now, The Old Man in the Pool, and it was at Lincoln Center. And it was the way that I arrive typically at what the shows are about. It comes down to sort of what I'm obsessed with at that moment. Like I feel like with any writing or art form or comedy or art form is like I feel like it's like what are you obsessed with? Ultimately, that's what your reader or listener will be obsessed with also if you're compelling enough. And the thing with me was mortality. Like I was in my 40s and I was like, "Oh, this is what I think about this a lot, like an inordinate amount of time." And so I just started writing about it. I was like, "Well, if I can make death funny, then I think that that'll be helpful to the audience, possibly."
I think your comedy is effective because you have just this kind of nonchalant way of delivering it through storytelling. Can you how do you create the story? Is there an arc? Is there a process? And how do you fit it into stand-up?
So yeah, I definitely do, and it is a process. I started working with my director, this guy named Seth Barish, who's a wonderful, wonderful theater director and actor. He was on the show Billions, along with me, but he and I talk through in the early forms. Like I start with just jokes, stories. What am I thinking about? What am I, what are my experiences? What's the funniest thing I can come up with? And at a certain point, he and I will talk about like, well, what are the themes that are running through this? And then we're sort of talking through like, well, what could be what we call the main event of the show. And um, with the sleepwalking show with Sleepwalk with Me, it was like I jumped through a second story window sleepwalking. And that one was sort of in a certain way obvious of like, oh, that's a really massive thing to happen in my life. And in this one, it's sort of a culmination of like realizing like, oh, I have type 2 diabetes and I failed the pulmonary test and I had bladder cancer when I was younger and kind of all of these things like a 150 car pileup coming over me and thinking about that kind of in relation to my daughter and my wife. And so that's usually the process.
So let's talk about that. You were faced with a sense of mortality or the prospect of you were very sick or potentially very sick at a very kind of an abnormally young age. How did that change your approach to your relationship with your wife and your daughter and just your view of life in general?
I think there's like two parts to that. Like I think that when I was younger, like when I was 20, I had bladder cancer and I was very lucky. They got all of it and I didn't have chemo or radiation, so I was very lucky. And I had when I was 25, I jumped through second story window sleepwalking. So I had these two kind of near death experiences young. And that did this thing where it really sped up my ambition for doing all the things that I wanted to do in my life. So it's funny. I relate very much to in one of your books, you talk about this idea of like in your 20s, you recommend to your students that they just put their head down and just work, 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 because ultimately that kind of will pay dividends later. And I think I had this thing where I thought, well, I don't know if there's gonna be a later, and so I'm just gonna try to get this all done now. And I think that as I've gotten older, my daughter's 8 years old, and I think in this phase of life, it's much more focused on, well, how can I, be a good father, be a good husband, and then connect with the people in the audience in a way that feels human.
You said something about the moment, and I thought it's probably more indicative of just the life you lead as an artist and a comedian. But I saw you after the show. I came back. You were generous. You hosted me and my son backstage, and I said, "How are you doing?" And pretty much right away, you said, "I'm lonely. I
Yeah,
haven't been with
yeah.
my wife and my daughter for a long time. I'm lonely." It strikes me that comedy, it must be very lonely that you're on the road a lot. You can I mean, I've always admired what feels like a really supportive, mutually supportive community with comedians amongst each other, but you're kind of in weird, crowded, or weird, dark lit places where people may or may not be nice to you, and
Yeah.
the whole point of getting to good stuff is having a bunch of bad stuff and then going home and kind of, like, trying to ignore the bad stuff. It just feels very lonely to me. Can you speak to that?
I think it is lonely. I think it's funny, like, when I watch my daughter and I started watching this summer this great documentary series on professional tennis called Breakpoint on Netflix, and I have to say, like, one of the things I love about it is you really get a sense of, like, these top 100, 200, 300 players in the world are not on easy street. Like, it is hard. It is hard to be one of these tennis players, and I do get the sense that it is lonely. Like, I when I watch it, I think like, "Oh, yeah, that's hard." You're all over the world. I mean, ultimately, like, you play your match and you go back to your hotel and it's just maybe just you or you and your partner, whatever it is. Um, yeah, I think stand-up is lonely. I think it's fundamentally it's a solo sport. You have to work out a lot in your mind. You need to sort of essentially, you need to outthink your audience and then make it seem like you're not outthinking your audience. And then, like you're saying, you deliver it as though it's just this thing you just thought of. And so that's sort of the magic trick of it. But yeah, London was really hard for me because I was away from Jenny and Una for about 4.5 weeks. And it reached a point of being yeah, it was hard. I mean, it was and I fortunately, some of my comedian friends, Jimmy Carr and Daniel Kitson and some other folks over there reached out and were sweet about, meeting up with me and stuff, but it is very hard.
So much about your show resonated with me, and there was this one piece, and I don't want you to do the bit, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about it, that even if you think of yourselves as a loving person, even if you're in the room with your family and you know you love them, they know you love them, you know they love you, you know they know you know they love them, and yet we just can't bring ourselves to tell each other that we love each other. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's funny, like, in some ways, I feel like it might be generational because, like, certainly, like, my wife and I say I love you to each other and to our daughter. But yeah, but I think my mom and dad's generation, they didn't say I love you. I say in the show, they said take care,
Yeah.
which is not the same.
Drive
And
safely.
drive safely. The one I heard in
Yeah.
London was jolly good. Uh, just all these different things to avoid the emotional connection. And yeah, I mean, and in some ways, that's a lot of what the show is about. Is like all we have is this moment and all we're promised is this moment right now, and it's like it just it seems as though it's the thing that you should do is express if you feel love towards someone to express it.
So we have a lot of young men that listen to this show. I'd love to for you to just when we do something called office hours. What advice would you have to young men in their 20s who are dating and maybe not having as much success as they'd hoped?
I mean I was there certainly. I have a joke in my new hour. The hour I'm touring right now is called "Please Stop the Ride," and I talk a lot about being single and how when you're single, somehow it feels like you're kind of roaming the earth, just saying like, "Does anyone want to be naked at the same time?" And then most people say no, and then some
With me.
people, yeah, exactly, and then some people say yes, and then you say no. It's like, and it's terrible, and I do think one of the things that's challenging is falling is the timing of falling in love is like a lot of times, you'll fall in love with someone and they're not at that moment in their life or to be in love, or they don't fall in love with you or whatever. And so I don't know what my advice would be other than I guess I would say open to communities, to be open to like g- you know being outside versus inside. I don't
Mhm.
know. Like I
Get
like
out, yeah.
yeah, I mean I don't know what's your best piece of advice for that?
First off, build yourself up so you can endure rejection, and then put
Yeah.
yourself in a bunch of random environments with strangers. And also, don't be afraid to be, I don't wanna call it the aggressor, but the initiator, to go up to strangers and express interest. But yeah, there's nothing easy. What about advice, to new fathers?
Oh my god. New father's advice would be do more than you think is the right amount of contribution in your house. It's never enough, and like whatever you can do to say to your partner, "Let me go get us I'm going to grab us bagels. I'm going to go get this. I'm going to, you know what I mean? Like I'm going to do the laundry. I'm going to do, like an infinite amount of things that could be helpful. I think will pay a lot of dividends later. I think of all of my regrets in my life, it's like that I wasn't helpful enough in the first year of my daughter's life. And I was helpful, but I think in hindsight, like, not I wasn't helpful enough.
We'll be right back. What would the next if in 10 years, if you thought, "Okay, this is where I wanna be in 10 years. This is the box still left to check or that I wanna check in indelible ink." What does that look like for you in 10 years as a comedian?
It's two things. I've directed two movies. I directed Sleepwalk with Me, which was an adaptation of the solo show. I directed this movie called Don't Think Twice, which is about a group of best friends in an improv group where played by Keegan Michael Key and Gillian Jacobs and a bunch of improvisers and comedians. And then one of them gets cast in like a Saturday Night Live type of show, and then the rest of them don't. And it's about what happens in friendship when people realize that not everybody gets the same thing. And I think I would like to make more movies, and I would like to make more specials. I wanna do those 2 things concurrently. Those are the things that bring me most joy, and they're the things that make me feel, most like I'm utilizing what I have to offer. Like, I watched 2 documentaries recently. One was on Nichols and May, and one was on Mike Nichols, and Mike Nichols' career I find to be fascinating because he started as this improviser in Chicago, and he paired up with Elaine May. They had a hit Broadway show, and then just interestingly, instead of going the route of capitalizing on being a stage performer and becoming, an actor, a big on camera person, he went the direction of like directing movies and becoming an auteur and injecting dramatic stories with humor. Like if you look at The Graduate, for example, it's a movie where the dramatic stakes are phenomenal and the story itself without humor is phenomenal. And I think ultimately what makes it transcendent is the moments of him in the pool underwater or him with the desk clerk at the hotel. And I think that that's what I'm always trying to do with my shows and I'm trying to do with my movies is how can you take a dramatic story and then inject it with humor in a way that sort of, it's the sugar that makes the medicine go down.
Yeah, so Mike Nichols, amongst other things, he did The Graduate, Working Girl, The Birdcage, and I have some of a what of a connection. A few months ago, I got a call from his spouse, obviously he's passed away, but Diane Sawyer, who wanted to talk about doing a special on young men. But yeah, he definitely seems to have lived a pretty rich life. So it sounds like you want to get behind the camera, be more involved in writing, producing, directing.
Yeah,
Would that be fair?
definitely. I think like I'm 45 now, and I feel like yeah, in the next 10 years, I'd like to get to a point where I'm consistently just writing and directing movies. But like, you've said this before on the podcast and on Pivot, it's like the the degree to which the industry is changing under our feet is so dramatic that the idea of movies, it's like we honestly, I think
What does that mean?
we don't know where that's even going.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about you've been a contributor on public radio, This American Life. Talk about and you were given the Kurt Vonnegut Award for humor. Talk about what the vision for that and what how you approach that and the impact it's had.
Well, I was really lucky. So in 2008, I told my sleepwalking story. Like, if people don't know it, it's just this very extreme story where I was diagnosed with REM sleep behavior disorder. But the way that I found out I had it was I jumped through a second story window of a La Quinta Inn in Walla Walla, Washington, which, by the way, I'm returning to in
That's the
January.
most depressing part of that story.
Then I'm going back.
Yeah, no, that you're going that it's a La Quinta.
Yeah, yeah.
It would have been much more dramatic if it had been, I don't know, just like a Four Seasons or
Yeah.
a club or something. But a La Quinta, that's I don't know.
Yeah.
You
No,
got to do you got to
it
work
was a
better.
it was a low point, and, so I told the sleepwalking story on, it was the Moth storytelling series at the time, and now it's a radio show on public radio, etcetera. They have books, it's a huge thing. But at the time, it was a storytelling series in New York, and they asked me to tell the sleepwalking story, and I did. 13 years ago, I jumped in my sleep through a second story window of a La Quinta Inn. Yeah, when I say through, I mean through the glass. The glass was double paned. I ended up with 33 stitches in my legs. The glass was a centimeter from my femoral artery. Had it struck there, I could have just bled out on the front lawn and died. I was diagnosed with a very rare thing. It's called REM behavior disorder. So when I go to bed at night, I take medication and I sleep in a sleeping bag up to my neck, and I wear mittens so I can't open the sleeping bag. And then Ira Glass, who's the host and producer of This American Life, who's like a legend in storytelling, and has won Pulitzers and Peabodys and all kinds of things. He really took to this story, and he said he wanted to put it on the show, and he reached out, and I said, I don't know if I'm comfortable putting it on the radio because it's part of my show, which I don't want to give away the show because so much of comedy is surprise. And he called me and he goes himself. Before that I was dealing with producers and assistants and other folks. And he called me and he said, I really think you should put this on the show. I don't think you realize the reach of our show. Like our show reaches like 5 million people. Like more people will call you about this than anyone's ever called you for anything. And then he and I like kind of struck up a friendship on the phone, and we said, let's get together in New York. And we started talking about a bunch of different stories that could work on This American Life. And then we ended up developing maybe like 5 or 10 stories over the course of a few years. And so I was on the show a lot, and and then he produced my 2 movies, and he's really mentored me and taught me like an extraordinary amount about storytelling. And a lot of the stuff, it's like all wisdom, kind of, or gained wisdom is like you're just sharing what someone else shared to you, and then they're sharing what someone shared with them, and so yeah, I feel so lucky to have crossed paths with Ira, and I try to pass it on. Like I'm a producer of Alex Edelman's show, which was on Broadway. It was called Just for Us. It's a wild story. It's about how he once was he did a piece about being Jewish on BBC radio, and he had all these anti-Semitic people following him and saying sort of hateful things on Twitter, and so he started following them back. And then one day, there was an open invitation for like, uh, kind of like a white nationalist kind of meeting in Queens, and he thought, "What would it be like if I just showed up at that?" And so he went, and that's what the show is all about. And so I helped him develop that, and I produced it, and a lot of the things that I share with Alex are things that are just, were taught to me by Ira.
And, again, we have a lot of young men or a lot of young people. Talk about the importance of being on time.
This is a bit that I did. I did a bit on, Thank God for Jokes about, the thing that that late people don't realize about us on-time people is that we hate you, and the reason why we hate you is it's so easy to be on time, you just have to be early, and early lasts for hours, and on time lasts a second, and then you're late, and I just rant on it. Honestly, like, you wanna talk about TikTok, it's like, I think it's a clip up on TikTok, it's one of my most popular clips, and part of the reason is because people fight over it in the comments. They're like, "I can't be on time because of this, and because of this, and because of this," and, uh, and then the other people go, "But you can be, you just set aside more time." Look, I don't wanna get into, like, the ideological side of being on time versus being early or late, but I will say this. When I was in college, my professor, John Glavin, who taught me writing, I was late for a class once early in the semester, and he just said, "You should drop out of the class." And I said, "No, no, I love the class." And he goes, "Well, no, you just don't, you clearly don't want to be here." And I said, "No, I really do." And basically, if you're late for his class, you don't get into the class. The door is closed and he doesn't want you there. And again, like, it's something that it was a class that I loved. It's my favorite class I've ever taken. It's on screenwriting, and I value it so much. And it was one of those, like, I don't know, it was like a pivotal moment where I was like, "Oh yeah, like, if you really want to be somewhere, be early. You just can't go wrong with that. If you really want to be there, go early."
Yeah, you did. I mean this sincerely. I've struggled with being on time. One, because I think I'm selfish, and I I think being late a lot is it's just selfish. You valuing your own time over other people's, and you just summed it up so perfectly. You basically said, and of course you did this as they did the late theater seating to mock people, but that you've got forever to be on time early.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got an appointment, for lunch this Friday with someone. I have between now and then to be early.
That's right.
And it just struck me like, what on earth am I ever doing being on time, much less late? I've got forever to be early. And it's just such a easy thing to just show a small smidgen of respect. But I want to just real briefly say that I found you, I sought you out, and as someone who's trying to be a good dad, trying to be a good husband, trying to be a good citizen, everything you said really resonated with me. And I have found people, quite frankly, comedians that make me laugh harder. You make me think more. You really do, and you make me feel more. You touch on very intense topics, sort of fearlessly. There's been comedians that talk about social issues fearlessly, that are profane fearlessly, but you talk about, very deep, meaningful issues, life, death, love, being a good dad fearlessly. Anyways, Mike, I hope that you continue to be fearless. Mike Birbiglia is a comedian, storyteller, director, and actor. In addition to performing live, Mike is an author and filmmaker who wrote, directed, and starred in the film Sleepwalk with Me and Don't Think Twice. As an actor, Mike has appeared on Inside Amy Schumer, HBO's Girls, and Broad City, as well as in the films Trainwreck, The Fault in Our Own Stars, and Popstar. Mike's latest special, The Old Man in the Pool, is out now on Netflix. Watch it twice. Mike joins us from his home in Brooklyn, New York. Mike, thanks again.
Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate it.